सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The global focus right now is on the war in Israel. That's the big focus. Within that, our many focus is on the quality of Israeli defense forces. Israeli defense forces, as Israeli intelligence, have acquired mythical reputations over the past 50-60 years. It's been felt that they are invincible, that there is nothing that happens that Israeli intelligence doesn't know. There is nothing that happens in your backyard or mine, or maybe even behind me as I record this in Bengaluru, as you may have figured out from the skyline, that everything is known to Mossad, and if it's Israel, if it's in Israel or around it, to Shin Bet, right? And similarly, Israeli defense forces are completely unbeatable, invincible. And that, however, is not true. That's not been true for the past 20 years. And that, many experts now think, is what led to the disaster that Israel faced just now. In fact, it's the largest number of Israelis killed on Israeli soil, largest number of Israelis killed on Israeli soil since 1948, right? You might say, what about the Yom Kippur War in 1973? That war was fought not on Israeli soil. That war was fought in Sinai Desert, which is Egyptian territory, or Golan Heights, which was then Syrian territory, or on the West Bank, not on the Israeli mainland. This is nearly 1,000 killed and many more thousand injured on Israeli mainland. The general consensus among experts, and these are experts not just in Israel, don't blame the Israeli left for this because Israel is also very polarized, but these are genuine scholars in Israel, the US, elsewhere, even in the Gulf countries, at Asian think tanks, who are saying that Israeli defense forces are not what they used to be. And when we say what they used to be, how far do we go back? So we go back to around 2000. We had quoted from a paper by Anthony Cordesman of CSIS, Center for Security and International Studies in Washington. He is a veteran strategic scholar, and he had said that Israeli defense forces have fought wars in 2006, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2018, 2019, 2022, and I'm adding 2021. But at the end of each war, they have failed to bring about a decisive degradation of extremist or terrorist groups. So each war has been bloody, it has caused a lot of destruction, but no war has resolved Israel's problems with extremists and terrorists. That is something that is said. I will also, as I go along, tell you one line each on each of these wars. The important thing is an observation, and I so wish that I had written this or I had spoken this, but unfortunately I haven't. But fortunately for us, someone else much smarter has said this, and this someone else is Uri Bar Joseph. Uri Bar Joseph is a very famous Israeli strategic scholar, author on intelligence and military affairs, but still more intelligence than military. He's a professor emeritus at Haifa University for Political Science. He's also the author of many famous books. His line, first of all, it's a wonderful line. His line is, and I quote, "Quality of a military is mainly decided by the quality of the enemy." Get it? The quality of a military is mainly decided by the quality of the enemy. When the enemy is Palestinian civilians and the Israeli defense forces, IDF troops spend more time guarding settlements and religious worshippers at Nablus than in rigorous training. The outcome is clear. Now, he's today a critic of the Israeli armed forces, but remember who he is. He's among the finest authors and one of the finest chroniclers of both successes and failures of Israeli defense forces and Israeli intelligence. I can list some of his books for you. A War of Its Own, that's his book on the Israeli Air Force in the Yom Kippur War. Then resilience, the IDF and the Yom Kippur War, and then it's classic, the angel, the Egyptian spy who saved Israel. This was the story of Ashraf Marwan, who was Jamal Abdul Nasir's son-in-law, and he was supposedly the Israeli agent who tipped off the Israeli intelligence just a couple of days before the Yom Kippur War that a war was coming. So those warnings were not taken very seriously, but still, when a warning came from him, finally Israeli Defense Forces were able to start mobilization just a day before the invasion came. So at least all of the Golan Heights were not reoccupied by the Syrians before the Israelis got there, and he saved Israel. This book was also then converted. It led to a Netflix movie by the same name, The Angel. Then he goes on to say, in criticism, introspecting, why did this failure come? This Hamas attack. He says, one, there was a failure of intelligence, lack of intelligence. Two, inadequate reaction. And three, the quality of political leadership. Because political leadership has now gone so far to the right, they are actually very fundamentalist in a religious sense. And that is where a lot of the professionalism goes away, professionalism and also accountability. He also says that there is a difference between the failure of 1973 and now. He said 1973, the warnings were there. Intelligence had done its job. It's just that some individuals did not take it seriously. After the war, those individuals paid the price because there was accountability. In this case, there was no information. There was no information, which is something that does not happen to Israeli intelligence. Shin Bet, Mossad, and also the Israeli military intelligence. The other article I'm leaning on is an article by Andrew Exum. Andrew Exum in the Atlantic magazine. Andrew Exum is not just another think tanker. He actually used to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle Eastern Policy at the US Department of Defense between 2015 and 17. And in that capacity was on the inside track for one of the extensive negotiations with the Israelis for renewing their arms aid from the US. The US and the Israelis have a permanent, continuing arms aid relationship, aid coming from the US to Israel. It is reviewed every 10 years. At this moment, the size of the American military aid to Israel is $3.8 billion per year. So he was on the negotiating track between 2015 and 17. So he knows something about the Israeli Defense Forces. And he says in this article, in fact, the headline of the article is, and you will see the screenshot on your screens, it says the Israeli military wasn't ready for this. And then he goes on to say the notion of an indomitable IDF is overdue for a revision. Tough words. And then he says that what's happened now, this failure and this success by Hamas has laid bare an uncomfortable truth. The fearsome reputation of the Israeli military, like Israeli intelligence, may be overdue for a revision. Then he goes on to say that Israeli army is very good. Israeli defense forces are very good if it comes to fighting their regular or their conventional enemies. If they were to fight Egypt, Syria, Jordan, these are the countries in the neighborhood with whom Israel has fought wars, then they are way superior to any of them. I would add to that even if there was a war with Iran, most likely Israeli defense forces will be way superior to the armed forces of Iran and way better equipped than the armed forces of Iran. But what is it that happened this time and what's been happening in the last 20 years that Israelis have not been winning? I counted for you all these wars they've had, but they haven't won these wars. That's because last 25 years, Israelis haven't fought a war against another country. When you fight a war against another country, a regular army, navy, air force, it's conventional, and then your conventional power reflects itself on the battlefield. When you're fighting an unconventional enemy who doesn't wear uniform, who can hide in civilian population, who's highly motivated, very well trained, has revenge on their minds, and also who do not follow the rules of conventional combat, who are not visible, right? You can take 100 tanks, but your enemy doesn't have a single tank. Your enemy might be somebody who's hiding in a building carrying a bazooka on his shoulder, right? How do you find that with 100 tanks? 100 tanks are not that much use. That is where we go back to Uri Bar Joseph's line, quality of a military is mainly decided by the quality of the enemy. The quality of the enemy in this case is very different. It's unconventional, And that's how Palestinian extremists, terrorists of various kinds, Hamas is only the most extreme of them, but there is also Hezbollah, who are from Lebanon. They are Shiite, right? These are extremists slash terrorists of various kinds, highly trained, highly motivated, very well armed for what they are going to do. At the same time, they engage you in asymmetric warfare. That's where a conventional army, air force, special forces all get shown up. So once again, Andrew Exum goes on to say that the Israeli Air Force is fantastic. It's world class, as good as any in the world. Israeli special forces are fantastic. The problem arises when you come to the main body of Israeli soldiers. And the money Israel has been spending, for example, this $3.8 billion a year, it's a lot of money. And a small country with an army which has a small area to defend, it's a lot of money. But they've been spending this money buying really fancy equipment like F-35s, which will be of fantastic value if you fought a conventional war against somebody, which now seems unlikely, against Egypt, because there's a peace treaty and a deal, and Egyptian politics has gone a very different way. Jordan is not capable of fighting at this point, nor was it capable of fighting at any point of time. In fact, it is the Jordanian incompetence at fighting that added to giving Israeli armed forces such a formidable reputation. Syrians can't fight. They've got so many problems of their own. If there is a conventional war, say against Iran, if Iran came in by itself, then these F-35s will be of value. Otherwise, they're of no value against Hamas or Hezbollah or any of these other terrorist or militant groups. Exum says that in the time that he spent in Israel, he in fact wrote a PhD on Hezbollah and spent time in northern Israel. Northern Israel is what abuts southern Lebanon. And that's where Hezbollah operate and fire rockets routinely. And he also interacted with a lot of Hezbollah fighters. And he says that I found that Hezbollah fighters were well trained and motivated. They were not very impressed with the Israeli armed forces. And why is that so? Exum says that while IDF is very good at learning from failures and mistakes, in fact, much better than the American armed forces, the problem arises that a lot of the main body of Israeli armed forces is conscripted. So it is only a semi-voluntary army or semi-professional army. These are people who are young people who are conscripted. They come in for a little bit of time, they go away. So what happens is that at any point of time, Israeli main units, it's not the Israeli Air Force, it is not the Israeli Special Forces, but let's say main infantry units, main armor units. They have a lot of turnover of new soldiers. So new young soldiers come in, fresh legs have their own value, but at the same time, before they get fully trained, they go away. And if they don't spend enough time with the unit to build a unit cohesion, and that becomes a liability for Israeli defense forces, he says, and that's gone on for too long. And he says because of this lack of cohesion, when an army unit goes on a raid or when an army unit is ambushed, that's when your intrinsic training, your instinctive responses come in, and that works much better among a body of troops who've been working together for a long time. Unlike these young conscripted troops who come in for a very short period, and by the time they get their basic training, they see some operations, they are on their way out. And he says that I find a lot of the Israeli soldiers look unkempt and slovenly also in their use of the uniform. And he says might look charming, right? Might look charming as compared to sort of stiff militaries, but at the same time, this nonchalance about the profession of arms does not work well. On top of that, he says, echoing what Uri Bar Joseph wrote, and he says most of their responsibilities so far are generally in their short service in the armed forces are more like policing, because they are guarding the West Bank settlers. So this is not really military training, and that has shown up in this case because the military took too long responding. Now, just as we began, I had listed all the wars that Israel has fought in the last 20 years or so, 25 years or so, and I had said how scholars are saying that Israel has failed to win any of these wars or failed to achieve its basic objective, which is decisively degrading the extremist and terrorist operational power. So first of these is 2006. 2006 was Lebanon war, led to a stalemate, led to nothing, a stalemate. Then came the Gaza war. In fact, many of these are Gaza wars. In fact, Gaza war of 2008, it was called Operation Cast Lead. Operation Cast Lead lasted 3 weeks, again settled nothing because soon enough Israeli armed forces were back in Gaza. How do we know that 2008-9 failed? Because through 2012, they were back there. This time they carried out an even more extensive operation in Gaza Strip. This was called Operation Pillar of Defense, right? So Operation Cast Lead, then Operation Pillar of Defense. Once again, how do we know it was a failure? Because in 2014, Israeli Defense Forces were back again in Gaza. This was called Operation Protective Edge. After that, 2018 was the Syrian civil war, where in a proxy manner, Iran and Israel got involved. Once again, that remains unresolved. Then 2021, there was Operation Guardian of the Walls, where? In Gaza, because IDF got back in Gaza. 2022, once again, there was a 10-day conflict with Gaza. That happened. That took place after incidents again at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And now, 2023, as I record this, we are in the midst of what is called as Operation Iron Sword. So this gives you the story, a 25-year history of Israeli Defense Forces, very formidable, among the best equipped in the world, led by some of the finest military minds in the world, failing to achieve their basic objective. And what is the reason? The reason is that they've been involved in this asymmetric warfare against an enemy who's not a cohesive force, an enemy that's not a nation, an enemy that's not an army, navy, air force. And that's the enemy, and I lean back again on the words of Uri Bar Joseph, that's the enemy that the Israelis are now allowing to define the quality of their military.